personality or for consciousness. Consciousness is really dependent on a functioning brain. We know that. When the brain functions differently, our consciousness is different. We have altered states of consciousness at different times. People with brain injuries or traumas or strokes or even people on drugs or people in epileptic seizures and temporal lobe, people who are suddenly scared. Your brain's going all sorts of different modes depending on physical factors. A physically functioning brain is necessary for consciousness. There's no evidence that consciousness can exist separate from that. The evidences of near-death experiences, as I will show later during rebuttal, are really evidences for hallucinations in a dying brain. Here's an analogy. This is not a perfect analogy, but let's just use it to make a point. You turn on the radio and you hear somebody's voice. Maybe there's some actor reading the words of Mark Twain on the radio, and you're listening to it. You're not actually hearing a human voice. You're certainly not hearing Mark Twain. And you're not even hearing that actor. You're hearing electronically generated pulses, which are making a usually paper speaker vibrate and produce airwaves, which correspond to a human voice. But what your brain does when it hears that, your brain makes a model. You have an illusion that you're listening to another human being. That person might be dead. You're not really listening to that person, but your brain is acting as if you are listening to another human being. In fact, you might think someone's in that other room with the radio's on. But when you turn the radio off, or if it gets broken, when the power stops running through that radio, there is no more illusion produced. It stops, it breaks down. In a similar way, and the analogy is not perfect because the human brain is much more complicated, but in a similar way, consciousness is like that. This is my opinion. I don't speak for all atheists, and there are different friendly arguments among atheists and skeptics and scientists about this, but in my opinion, when the power is shut off to a functioning brain, the mind is gone. There is no mind. There is no consciousness. It has to be turned on and it has to be working. What we do, just like you build a model of that voice, we build a model of things around us to simplify. Like in a car, you're driving a car, there's a little picture on the dashboard of the car itself within the car, shows you what doors are open in that. There's a model within the vehicle, and the same thing in our brains. We make little simplified models of our surroundings and of our world and of our friends and of that. We also, in our complicated brain, are able to make a model of ourselves. We are able to model ourselves as we function, and then we were able to take this perceptive part of our brain and not just apply it to a model of somebody speaking on the radio, but we can apply it to our own functioning brain. And as that brain is functioning, that gives us what Douglas Hofstadter calls the strange loop, this idea that we're a perception of perception. The human brain is complex enough that we can do that, and so we create this model, and that's what consciousness basically boils down to. It's in different forms, it's in different ways. If you have brain injuries, you all know the story of Phineas Gage, when the railroad worker whose frontal lobe was just torn out, but he survived, but he was a different person. You know what happens with Alzheimer's? We know what happens with sicknesses. We know how our brains change. If a baby dies, does the baby go to heaven as a baby with an undeveloped adult mind? What is this soul thing that Dinesh thinks somehow exists separately, immaterially from the body? If it does, it's not me. If there is this soul thing, regardless of my skepticism, and there might be something like that, who knows? Science is always being surprised. We don't need Dinesh D'Souza to tell us that science is going to have more surprises in the future that are going to be non-intuitive, that we're going to say, wow, I didn't know that. So this is great. That's what drives science. But I am the person who's interested in surviving, not this soul thing. It's an immaterial, impersonal, whatever it is that maybe can transmogrify in some other universe. I am the person I care about. You've heard the joke about the guy who asked people, at your funeral, what would you like to hear people say? One person said, well, she said, I would like to hear people say that I was giving and generous and a good mother. Another guy said, I would like to hear people say that he was intelligent and hardworking and creative. The other guy said, I would like to hear people say, look, he's moving. Who cares about a soul? If I do have a soul, I don't care if it lives on forever. That's not me. I am a biological organism. I am an animal with physical bodies, with physical instincts which were handed to me from my parents who fell in love. And my brother Daryl is here. Where's Daryl? He came down from Washington. He's out here somewhere. Daryl knows the story. My dad didn't want to have a family yet. He thought they didn't have enough money. They fell in love and got married. And he said, let's wait a couple years to have a family. But my mom was ready to have a family. And the story, I won't tell you all the details, but there was a seduction on a secluded beach north of Los Angeles. And here I am. I'm still picking sand out of my hair, too. But I am the result of a physical process. My mom and dad, the recombined DNA from their parents, came together. I got 46 chromosomes, which determined my height, my skin color, my eye color, my hair color when I had hair. And all sorts of things about my metabolism, the way my brain functions. We know from studies of identical twins that there's really not that much free will. There's some things that are, at least half of us is genetically predetermined. I am a genetically, physically developed human being. You ask me how old I am, we count it from the day I was physically born, not from some amorphous time when some soul supposedly existed. So if I'm going to live forever, I want me, myself, Dan Barker, this human body to live forever, not some subatomic particle that might be able to transport into another dimension in the universe. It's not the individual particles, it's the arrangement of the atoms and the elements that make me who I am. And it's that functioning brain that is on that makes me conscious and aware. This is the life I care about. I actually think there is life after death. I think there's an afterlife. We're living it now. On that beach north of California, there were probably how many million sperm looking for that target. I was the one that made it. Each one of you is the one that made it. You beat out those others. They were little life forms with energy, wanting to reach the goal of the afterlife, but they didn't. They didn't. You did, and I did, and we got there. We met our maker, our mother, the egg. We got there. We're here. We get to live. This is it. This is our afterlife, and we get to die. That's part of the bargain. Who cares if life is eternal? Like Woody Allen said, if there is eternal life, when does it end? You know? He also said, I don't believe in life after death, but just in case, I'm taking a change of underwear. He was funny. So, life after death is not universal, as Dinesh points out. There are cultures who had no concept of a life after death. There's a tribe in the Amazon, the Pinahan tribe, which Daniel Everett describes. No concept of a God or an afterlife. Or when people die, they're just dead. They're just gone. It is not true that there's a universal yearning for life after death. There's a universal yearning for life. We want to keep our life. We want to survive. And so many cultures think, well, let's continue that survival. Let's continue it on. Dinesh D'Souza wrote a book called Life After Death, The Evidence. And right on the front cover of the book, it says, The Evidence. If you read his book, there it is. So I'm thinking, oh good, well let's see this evidence. Well, most of it, as his opening statement was just a bunch of hand-waving about philosophy that makes perhaps a philosophical warrant for us to continue our beliefs. Basically his book is really an attack on atheism. I'm not saying that makes it bad in itself. That's an interesting topic, but it's not evidence for life after death. There's only one chapter that deals with evidence. And by evidence, we don't mean proof. Evidence is something we can test to see if it holds up or not. In that one chapter that offers to give evidence in Dinesh's book, this 20-page chapter, most of that's devoted to reincarnation. He gives stories of people not with life after death, but life before death. He concludes these are powerful stories, and he says reincarnation is possible, but it's unlikely. Now, I wonder if your assessment of the likelihood of reincarnation might have something to do with your country of origin, perhaps, or with people that you know who claim to have been reincarnated. But in any event, he says it's possible, but unlikely. Then, 5 pages of his book are devoted to near-death experiences. Most of them really are not evidence. They're stories, like Ernest Hemingway. A bomb exploded when he was in the war, and Ernest Hemingway had a near-death experience. Of course, he wasn't dead. He thought he was dying. People can have near-death experiences that are triggered by things other than dying, and Dinesh admits this. But in those 5 pages, there's one paragraph which actually is evidence. One paragraph. It's about the blue shoe. Have you heard about the blue shoe, the story in Seattle? This woman named Maria supposedly died, or was clinically dead, and she floated out of her body, and she saw things she couldn't have known. And Maria then went outside the building, and she saw a blue shoe on the ledge that she could not have known was there. That's it. That's all the evidence you get out of Dinesh's book, that one half-page paragraph. That's evidence in the sense that it's something you can test, something you can look at, something you can examine. But what Dinesh doesn't tell us is more important than what he does tell us. That story was told by Kimberly Clark Sharp, who herself had a near-death experience, who is known to exaggerate and to have leading questions. She said she interviewed a woman named Maria, who nobody knows who she was, a migrant worker probably. And this Maria told her the story. She told it 7 years later. And people have decided, well, let's look at this. How do we investigate? They can't find this Maria. We can't cross-examine her. We can't know if she's had a history of epileptic seizures or of exaggerations. We can't test her veracity or her mental health. So these two researchers named Ebert and Mulrooney, I think, there's two researchers, decided to go to that hospital. They went 10 years later to that same hospital. Said, let's look at this story that Kimberly Clark Sharp told us. They went and they found the ledge where the shoe supposedly was, and they put a shoe there to see how visible it was. And sure enough, from the front of the hospital, that shoe that Kimberly Clark says nobody could have known about was clearly visible. In fact, this Maria person had been to that hospital a number of times. They walked around, they could see it from the front, from the entryway. They went up to the room, and you could see that shoe on the ledge where she said she couldn't have seen it. You could see it from her room. You could see the shoe without even leaning out the window. You could see that shoe. In fact, when the guys went to retrieve the shoe, it was gone. Somebody had spotted it. Somebody had spotted it and moved it. So obviously, Kimberly Clark Sharp is exaggerating. Obviously, and there are evidences of her and other near-death experience proponents exaggerating and asking leading questions about people. That is Dinesh's evidence. 7 years later, by a non-person, secondhand, where's the shoe? Where's the evidence from that? That is it. Now, I know there have been other attempts to corroborate near-death experiences, but for the record, right now, and I'll get to this during my rebuttal time, there's never been a confirmed case of any remote viewing during an out-of-body experience of a near-death experience. There hasn't been any. There have been attempts to do that. People have tried, they put things in the room that nobody could have seen to try to test that. So far, and the tests have been small, they've only been a year long, so far that hasn't happened. When you look at the evidence, and Dinesh gives one slim evidence, in addition to all his hand-waving philosophical possibilities and warrants for perhaps this that makes our belief okay, when you scratch beneath the surface and look beyond what the proponents of near-death experiences are telling you, you will find there's not that kind of a uniformity. Dinesh is wrong to say that in India they have tunnels. Tunnels are a very rare experience in near-death experiences, and tunnels only appear in Western stories of near-death experiences. They don't see lights in other cultures, and later I'll go on to show that this claim of uniformity of the near-death experience is really grossly exaggerated. And besides, it proves nothing. As Dinesh admits, a near-death experience is not a death experience, it's an experience. Dinesh says that nobody has gone to the other side and come back to tell us. But according to the near-death experience stories, many people have actually crossed over and gone to the other side and actually crossed that line and came back to tell us about it. One of them was a soldier, a sailor on a frigate who was electrocuted. He fell down on his face on the ship, and he found himself standing in a field of yellow corn. And he had this feeling of peace. And then this blue train came to him. And the people on this blue train were beckoning him to get on. So he got on the train, and they were gone. He had crossed over. But then he felt something physical. Now, how can a soul feel something physical? And then he came back to life.